Welcome to the W.E.B. Du Bois and the 100th Anniversary Gift of Black Folks webinar series. So glad that you can join us for this last installment of the anniversary and just celebrating W.E.B. Du Bois and his pivotal work, The Gift of Black Folks. This is the sixth and final installment of the webinar. Wanted to thank a number of individuals who were really pivotal in the planning of this work, including Dr. Stephen Breck-Reed, who's the Vice Provost for Faculty and Diversity and Belonging here at Baylor University, Dr. Stephanie Body, the Associate Professor of Church and Community Ministries, Dr. Jerry Park, Associate Professor of Sociology, Mr. Ezra Cho, Theology and Philosophy Librarian, Sine Woods, Associate Professor and Documents Librarian, Baylor University, and Dr. Ronald Angelo Johnson, the Ralph and Bessie May Lynn Chair of History and Associate Professor. And of course, yours truly, I'm Dr. Jamal-Dominique Hopkins, Associate Professor of Christian Scriptures and Director of the Black Church Studies Program. This webinar series is proudly sponsored by a number of groups across Baylor University, Baylor's offices, schools, academic programs, and just a number of programs. And so we're truly, truly grateful for the sponsorship. And like I said, this webinar series, this is the sixth webinar series. The first webinar explored Black explorers, Black laborers. The second webinar explored emancipation of democracy. And these all follow along the gift of Black folks, the book, the chapters. The second webinar, the emancipation of democracy. The third webinar featured reconstruction of freedom. And the fourth seminar was Negro art and literature. The fifth seminar was freedom and womanhood. And again, the sixth and final episode, this webinar series is the gift of the spirit, which is chapter 9 of W.E.B. Du Bois's 1924 publication, The Gift of Black Folks. I want to really encourage each of you that are joining us. Thank you for joining us to really get your hands on this text. This is a groundbreaking and a pivotal work, the gift of Black Folks, W.E.B. Du Bois's 1924 publication, and we're going to be talking about the gift of the Spirit. And I have an august panel that's joining me here, and you're going to be in for a treat. They are, and I want to actually remind those who are chiming in today to place your questions in the chat box so we can make sure we get your questions for these panelists. The panelists, of course, includes Dr. Eric Lewis Williams, who is at Duke Divinity School, Duke University. We have Dr. Selina Stone, who is lecturer of theology and ethics at the University of Edinburgh in the UK. We have Dr. Alonzo Johnson, who is associate professor of theology at Allen University's Dickerson-Green Theological Seminary in Columbia, South Carolina. And we have none other than my colleague here at Baylor University, Dr. Jonathan Tran, who is Associate Dean for Faculty in the Honors College and Associate Professor of Theology and Great Text here at Baylor University. I want to remind students that are joining, students that are going to be watching in, that there will be a code for credit. So you want to be able to be on the watch out or be on the lookout for that. And again, I want to remind those of you that are joining today for this discussion, the gift of the Spirit, to go ahead and place your questions into the chat, and we'll be sure to get your questions in. And as each of the speakers presents, you may have thoughts, and there will be time for you to jot your question down and put that in the chat. Again, I'm your host for this webinar, the sixth webinar, The Gift of the Spirit, Dr. Jamal-Dominique Hopkins, Director of the Black Church Studies Program at Baylor University's George W. Truett Theological Seminary. And I'm so glad to to be with you. So glad that you're joining. Without further, I want to introduce our first speaker who will give a 10-minute presentation. And I'm so honored to introduce him, and he is none other than Dr. Eric Lewis Williams. He is the director of the Office of Black Church Studies and assistant professor of theology assistant professor of theology and Black Church Studies at Duke University Divinity School. He is the co-editor of the all-important T&T Clark Handbook of African American Theology. You got to get that work, which is published by T&T Clark. And Can't Nobody Do Me Like Jesus, photographs from the Sacred Steel Community, published by the University Press of Mississippi. Brother Eric is a scholar and a lover of the Black church, and I'm so glad to introduce him and to hear his opening presentations. Brother Eric, please share what you have.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to be here with you today and to be with Dr. Hopkins and, of course, one of my theological mentors, Dr. Alonzo Johnson, a dear friend from my alma mater, University of Edinburgh, Dr. Selina Stone, and a former, well, we were in school together at Duke University, Dr. Jonathan Tran, who I look forward to building with him in the very near future. I'm grateful to be here today, and because I'm with friends, I said that I would just lay out a few things, and whatever I don't hit, I know my friends will catch, and they will do the heavy punching. But I prepared my comments today as a form of kind of contextualization, and I've prepared my comments from the title, "To Them, All the World is Spirit: Cosmological Considerations in Dubois's Gift of Black Folk." Published in 1924, The Gift of Black Folk is a groundbreaking text that has challenged prevailing stereotypes of Black Americans and documented their significant contributions to American society. Du Bois argues that Black people have played a crucial role in shaping America's democracy, freedom, music, literature, and economy. Just a word about the context in which the text emerges. It was a context of what I like to think of as racial terror and cultural revival. In 1924, the Ku Klux Klan was experiencing a resurgence, and segregation was the rule of law. Amidst the terror and oppression, Du Bois published his book to counter the racist narratives and to highlight the achievements of Black Americans. His work was a powerful response to the systemic racism of the time, and it demonstrated the importance of racial diversity for the future of the emerging republic. And while for Black Americans, 1924 was a time of racial terror and social oppression, a cultural explosion was underway. The Harlem Renaissance, a movement that celebrated Black art, literature, and culture, was in full swing. And Du Bois's book can be read alongside or as part of this larger movement, as he uses historical narrative as a form of resistance against racism. By highlighting the achievements of Black Americans, Du Bois and other writers and artists aim to challenge the notion of Black inferiority and demonstrate the inherent value and worth of Black people. Just as an aside, during the Harlem Renaissance, Du Bois was in conversation with numerous Black intellectuals and artists, including civil rights activists James Weldon Johnson, Marcus Garvey, as well as key figures of the Renaissance like Langston Hughes, Zora Hurston, Countee Cullen, who was actually his son-in-law, because in 1928, Countee Cullen married Du Bois's daughter, Yolande, on April 9th of 1928. Some of the major themes of the text is the importance of racial diversity to American society, the struggle for freedom and equality as a fundamental aspect of American democracy, the significance of African-American contributions to American culture and history. And within these themes, some of the key points that Du Bois raises is he highlights the role of African-Americans in American history from the earliest explorers to the 20th century. He emphasizes their contributions to various fields of endeavor, including agriculture, the tobacco, sugar, cotton, and rice economy, war efforts, the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Civil War, inventions like ice cream and the player pianos, and social reforms like the free public schools. Du Bois argues that Black people have been instrumental in expanding democracy and winning rights for poor whites and themselves. He asserts that the story of American history is deeply intertwined with the experiences of Black people. And for all of the contributions that Black folk made to American culture, in this arresting chapter that we have before us today, on the gift of the Spirit, which is chapter 9, Du Bois argues that the realms of religion and spirituality must be central in any such considerations. Now, what's interesting about Du Bois is that for decades, scholars and readers of Du Bois have noted what they perceive to be an ambivalence around Du Bois and religion. Some of the reasons for this perceived ambivalence is that Du Bois never, attended church regularly as an adult. He didn't acknowledge private religious practices. He displayed open discomfort with religious expression and performance. And he was thought to have made a lifetime commitment to the social scientific criticism of religion. On the other hand, Du Bois uses religious language and imagery throughout his work. And what comes to mind is when he talks about the middle passage, and he talks about that as a descent into hell. So he uses the language of the creed. They descended into hell to talk about something like the middle passage. He at one time taught Sunday school classes and had favorite hymns. He's considered a pioneer of the study of African American religion. He was a friend of clergy persons, and in his writings, he invoked God, Christ, and apocalyptic visions in some of his writings. So not religious, but doing things that religious people kind of do. One of the scenes that gets a lot of attention when we think about Du Bois is the account that is given during his 2-year stretch at Wilberforce University in the 1890s. He taught on the faculty of Wilberforce, which is a university of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He taught there 1894 to 1896. But there is an encounter that he has there that gets a lot of attention, for he's asked to pray. And when they ask him to pray at this Christian institution, he tells them, "I'm not doing that." He flatly refuses to pray. And so there are those who saw his refusal to pray as a reflection of his broader skepticism towards traditional religious practices. But then there is the fact that he wrote prayers. In fact, there is a text that's been published, that was published posthumously, entitled "The Prayers of Dark People," Prayers for Dark People, which contains a collection of Du Bois's prayers from his time when he worked in Atlanta for Atlanta University. Now, I just want to read a quote from Du Bois, where he kind of points to the importance of religion within this, when we're trying to give an account of the contribution of Blacks to democracy and to American life. He says, Above and beyond all that we have mentioned, perhaps least tangible, but just as true, is the peculiar spiritual quality which the Negro has injected into American life and civilization. It is hard to define or characterize it. A certain spiritual joyousness, a sensuous tropical love of life, in vivid contrast to the cool and cautious New England reason, a slow and dreamful conception of the universe, a drawling and slurring of speech, an intense sensitiveness to spiritual values. All these things and other things like them tell of the imprint of Africa on Europe and America. There is no gainsaying or explaining away this tremendous influence um, of the contact of the North and South, of Black and white, of Anglo-Saxon and Negro. So Du Bois is pointing to this fact that we really need to grapple with religion. And I believe that what Du Bois is trying to get at, and I look forward to conversation about it later in this discussion, is what people like the sociologists of religion, C. Eric Lincoln has called the Black sacred cosmos, which he defines as a pervasive, residual African cosmological framework that informs ways of knowing, ways of apprehending, and managing reality. It influences devotional options and expressive behaviors. It is in large measure constitutive of African American identity, especially their religious identity. And this comes from C. Eric Lincoln's book, The Black Church and the African American Experience, that was published in 1990. But Du Bois's comments about religion and the centrality of religion also, for me, it carries me back to the debate that was played out between Melville Herskovitz and E. Franklin Frazier regarding the perduring Africanisms, the question of perduring Africanisms within African American religious life, well, cultural life, but also religion would be a very important part of that, as well as there's a study that was published by a scholar of Brazilian religions entitled "The African Religions of Brazil Toward a Sociology of the Interpenetration of Civilizations." One of the things that Du Bois says about the spirituality of Blacks, that it not only informs their lives, but it also impacts the ways of white folk in the American context. So just so it was not like a one-way kind of thing. So religion, and I'll speak in terms of Christianity, was adopted, but it was also adapted. That, as one person said it, that it wasn't simply that the Africans were converted to Christianity, but the Africans actually converted Christianity. And these are the kinds of issues that I'm hoping that we can get into today, as I think that this chapter 9 of The Gift of Black Folks on the Gift of the Spirit invites us to begin to wrestle with these issues afresh. So thank you very much for this opportunity to share, and look forward to some more conversation later. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to remind those of you that are watching to in the audience to go ahead and put your questions in the chat. And so that way we can pull your questions. So I've already got some real nuggets from Dr. Williams' presentation. But the next presenter I want to introduce is Dr. Selina Stone. She is lecturer in theology and ethics at the University of Edinburgh. A native of Birmingham in the United Kingdom, she is both a graduate of the University of Birmingham in the UK and King's College London. Her first academic monograph is entitled The Spirit and the Body Towards a Womanist Pentecostal Social Justice Ethic, which was published by Brill in 2003. She is a scholar, a consultant, and a woman of faith who has also published Tarry a While, Wisdom from Black Spirituality for People of Faith, published by SPCK Publishing. Dr. Stone, we are grateful that you are here, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hopkins. It really is a pleasure to be here with you. It's my afternoon and your morning. And I'm sharing some thoughts on this from across the pond in a UK context. And I really am thankful to be able to contribute to this discussion today. In this chapter on the gift of the Spirit, Dubois explores themes which are particularly pertinent for many of us who in the UK might describe ourselves as Black British, African or Afro-Caribbean or African. The themes are important for me in particular as a Black Brit of Jamaican heritage, a theologian whose scholarship has and continues to engage with the themes of British missionary Christianity, slavery and its afterlives. I specifically appreciate Dubois's framing of this discussion as seeking to tell of the imprint of Africa on Europe in America, specifically in relation to religion and spirituality. This is what it means, of course, to think about Du Bois's work on race in America. It is about Europe in America. Europe, of course, has not only been in America, but across, and doesn't only continue to be in America, but across Asia, indigenous lands globally, Africa, the Caribbean, etc. And Europe, while being in all of these places, has continued to and continues to exist in its own space. I live within it, in the UK in particular, which I often talk about as being in the heart of an old empire, which continues to dream of its golden days of colonial dominance and imperial violence around the world, though often not discussed as openly as that. It's often a lot more polite. It is in denial about its decline, the shifts in world power, and its need for alliances, which is one way of seeing our decision to leave the EU. And here in 1924, Du Bois reflects directly on the historic struggle of Europeans who think they must do something about Africans and their descendants, especially in relation to religion, spirituality, and theology. Du Bois explains that in transplanting the Negro to the United States, America transplanted, and I quote directly, a certain spiritual entity and an unbreakable set of world-old beliefs, manners, morals, superstitions, and religious observances, end quote. Africans, in other words, had ways of knowing the divine way before missionaries arrived with their own European cultural forms of the Christian faith. These African ways of knowing the divine included indigenous, sometimes called traditional heritage religions or spiritualities, and also forms of Christianity that preceded the colonial era and are seen, for example, in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which traces its roots back to the Ethiopian eunuch in the Book of Acts. In these African contexts, the binaries so common to Western cultures, dividing the spiritual from the social, political, or economic, for example, are anathema. Religion is life, Du Bois writes. To the Negro, all the world is spirit. Particularly striking to me is Du Bois's account of the persisting role of the priest in the realm of religion and medicine for the African people living under enslavement. Described as one who is responsible for what we might consider spiritual discernment as well as interpretation, in his words, comforting the sorrowful and expressing lament on behalf of a people. He paints a picture of the kind of spiritual figures Black communities continue to need in a world which continues to question our humanity, deny our dignity, and undermine our hope. This means something particular for Black churches in America, but also in the UK or wherever they are found. But it causes me also to ask where we might find these figures when our churches sometimes have failed to take up this form of priestliness. In our British context, there is some awareness of the declining relevance of Black churches as the generations progress. And I'm thinking here particularly about African Caribbean churches, which are the longest standing Black churches in the UK compared to the more recent West African churches. But the decline of Black churches has been out of sync with the wider decline of Christianity in Europe because we arrived later. And so Black churches were buying and outgrowing buildings that were already emptied of Anglicans in the 80s and 90s, and even before then. For the Windrush generation, which represents the first major migration of African Caribbeans to post-war Britain from 1948, Black churches, often Pentecostal, sprung up and grew as people brought with them forms of Christianity that were distinct from and were rejected by the many mainstream white churches in the UK, most notably established Anglican churches who proliferated in the Caribbean but rejected Caribbeans in the UK. Caribbeans who were Anglicans were denied a spiritual home in Anglican churches, and many often became Pentecostal, simply because they joined congregations where they received welcome despite those theological and liturgical differences. These black churches were social hubs, places for partners. In Jamaican culture in particular, these were kind of informal credit unions. There were places to find housing, spaces for supplementary education. In the generations which have followed, though, this has ceased to be the case, as some church leaders have imbibed a kind of dualism which is decidedly un-African, particularly in the way Dubois describes it, and decided to keep their minds on what they imagined were spiritual matters narrowly understood. Fast forward to now, to the fourth generation post-Windrush, and many African Caribbeans no longer know what it is to grow up in the black institutions Dubois describes. There is a persistent spiritual attunement, but younger people no longer look to those within church spaces for religion and medicine, but to themselves, their friends, to influencers, podcast hosts, the waiter who serves brunch, to yoga instructors. I know some of this is also true in the American context, as I know some work by the Pew, funded by the Pew Research Center, has shown similar trends in the US as well. So my question is, then how then do we quantify the gift of black folk in our contemporary times? How has the spiritual entity of black faith and spirituality evolved over time in US, but also in Europe as well? We are in the UK at a time when the contributions of black people to religious and spiritual life have been recognised on some level. Sometimes that's in discussions around church numbers. So while the white mainstream churches have been in decline, black churches have often been thriving. This is particularly the case of the West African churches, which developed in strength in the 80s and 90s as migration really increased. So that black churches are often loved because they prop up the numbers of Christian faith of Christian believers in the UK. But there are still remnants of a kind of racism that pervades in the assumptions about black spirituality, black theologies, and black spiritual practices. I was asked last year to write the Lent book Tarry a While, which was for the Archbishop of Canterbury to endorse for the Church of England. And I wrote this in what I now consider, in light of reading this particular chapter, a Duboisian tone for its desire to make clear once and for all that accounts of Christian history, theology, and spirituality have too often overlooked and disguised African heritage, figures, and perspectives. The push to recall and centre these voices and visions is not for the sake of Africans and African-descended people, since we already know it. We have already been gifted with these wisdoms by the divine and the teachings of our ancestors, our families, and our teachers. But it is for the sake of the church as a body and the world in which the church seeks to witness to God's ways and being, that we tell the full truth of how God has made God's self known from and within all contexts and in the lives of all peoples. But I will be honest and push back a little on the language of gift. I know we're celebrating this book, but I also want to offer a critical response. Because the idea that we as African descended peoples even need to argue for our dignity and our worth. And I understand the context in which Dubois is writing this particular account of the gift of black folk. But as I reflected on this in my own context, and particularly the work that has been done here around racial inclusion and diversity, this language of gift can very easily become problematic and even weaponized. So I'm at the point now where I'm quite unbothered by whether Britain as a nation or the established church in our context sees us as a gift. I am more concerned about the extent to which we understand ourselves as black people as divine gifts to each other, first and foremost, as people who simply by being provoke divine delight. I'm concerned with any language that might be co-opted for utilitarian ends. We have been called gifts against our will to fulfill white colonial and imperialistic dreams. And so I'm a little bit resistant to that language of gift that can easily be used to objectify black bodies, labour and hopes. I think of Sam Sharp, a Jamaican national hero, a Baptist preacher, who under the guise of preaching and leading prayer meetings organised a slave revolt in 1831 to 32 that was later called the Baptist War in Jamaica. And this was a kind of divine gift, but not one that was wanted or recognised as such, because it disrupted a violent imperialistic economic order in which Africans were chattel, dehumanized and exploited for their labor. This was a Christianized order, of course, with a slave Bible to match, and a white Jesus who hated the black human being while preaching spiritual salvation and life after death. So a divine gift, and I have to disagree with the end of this chapter a little bit, does not necessarily mean meekness and humility. For that can in the end amount to simply agreeing with those who designate you non-human, or at least being perceived as agreeing. Fire can be a gift, and this is where the Spirit is, a fire that burns away unholiness and evil, that stokes prophetic protest and rebellion. This, I think, is also the gift of the Spirit, and this for me is Pentecostal imagery around fire as well. And this, I think, is a gift of the Spirit we see epitomized in so many of the black heroes on both sides of the Atlantic, and on all three sides of the Atlantic, who have offered their lives to make this world what it should be. And I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Stone. That was on fire. So yeah, I got a page full of questions here. And again, of course, those of you that are watching this webinar, go ahead and put your questions down in the chat. I want to encourage you to do that. Our next panelist is none other than Dr. Alonzo Johnson. Dr. Johnson is Associate Professor of Theology at at Allen University's Dickerson-Green Theological Seminary in Columbia, South Carolina. He is the author of the monograph Good News for the Disinherited, Howard Thurman on Jesus of Nazareth and Human Liberation, published by the University Press of America. And he is also the co-editor of the University of South Carolina Press publication, Ain't Gonna Lay My Religion Down, African American Religion in the South. Dr. Johnson is an academician, an intellect, and a pastor of Universal Outreach Church of God in Christ in Irmo, South Carolina. Dear friend, dear brother, I'm glad you are with us, and we look forward to your remarks to this discussion. You can go ahead and turn your camera on so we can hear from you. Blessings.
Blessings to you, my friend and colleague, Dr. Hopkins, and to the other members of this distinguished panel. Thank you for having me and allowing me to share with you on this very, very important topic. And I want to begin my comments thanking you for considering me, as well as with reflecting on what I think is something that, as I jump out at, and it's been a minute since I read this particular work, and in going back and reflecting for this presentation, I thought that there were a couple of things that I wanted to jump right out at that I think if you look both at The Souls of Black Folk, which is 1903, and this work, which comes some 20 years later, there's something that I think is very relevant to our times, just as it was relevant to Boyce's time. And that is in writing about people of African descent, W.E.B. Du Bois was emphatic and clear about one central thing that I think speaks to our times as well as his, and that is that when you're talking about people of African descent, when you're talking about the people to whom he wrote at the beginning of the 20th century, and then some 20 years later, you're talking about enfleshed humans. May seem a bit trite now, but then writing as he did against the backdrop of centuries-old notions about people of African descent having no inherent rights that had to be respected by the people in power in America, their enslavers and their descendants, about whether or not they were fully humans. The discussion that he has in both texts about the gyrations that Christians, both Catholics and Protestants, went through in determining whether or not they should preach to the Africans and their descendants in America, whether or not they had souls, and if they had souls that were eternal and recognized by God as deeming needing to be saved, just as theirs would, then how could we preach to them, convert them, baptize them, and not free them? And so the discussions about whether or not, slavery was a missional command or command from God for the church, missional in the sense that in getting the gospel to these people, we were delivering them from heathenism, or whether they really didn't have souls to save. That issue in the middle of that discussions for European, Dubois is affirming the humanity of people of African descent. Not only fully human in flesh, humans with souls, thus the souls of Black folk, the gift of Black folk, uses theological language to, in fact, assert something that in that time certainly was not appreciated, celebrated, nor fully embraced in any sense in this society. So affirming Black humanity. Before you can talk about the gift, just affirming the humanity of Black people and putting that there as something to be celebrated, culturally, something to be celebrated and understood within the political context, and certainly something to be celebrated in the spiritual context. So I want to just start there, this affirmation of the sacredness of Black humanity in a day, as Dr. Williams is also noting, where lynching was on a rise. It was the order of the day. The affirmation of Black humanity was central to him, which gets us to the point, whether as we look into the 21st century and talk about Black Lives Matter, whether we look now and talk about issues such as DEI and the way that people look at Black contributions to this country, when you go through and look at what he talks about in The Gift of Black Folk, which you've outlined over the course of your discussion of the different chapters of this book, it has to begin again with this first point. We are affirming Black humanity, not apologizing for it, not making not apologizing for it, affirming it, embracing it, and allowing it to speak for America as well as speak to America. I start there. And I think that's important because, again, it adds to our discussion in and around things related to how we value people, how we value life, etc. The next thing that I want to emphasize is the discussion of the centrality of the Spirit, the centrality of the Spirit. And I know he's not using spirit in the theological sense fully, but just emphasizing the role of the Spirit, as we've talked about here, as a way of talking about religion. I think that's central because what Dubois is doing here is, even though, he is 100 years before much of this discussion that exists, 100 years and more ahead of much of the discussion that we have now in theological circles about the future of religion and about whether or not religion among African Americans or religion in general has a place in the public square, has a place in university life, has a place in public life outside of the spaces of our churches, mosques, synagogues, and other kinds of gatherings. What he is putting front and center here is that for people of African descent, spirituality, religion, God talk is essential not just for what is done in the sacred space of churches, essential not just for what is done in one's private life, but essential for how we engage the world, how people of African descent engage the world. And I think in lifting that up, as troubled as he was, well, trouble is not a good word, but as uncomfortable as he was, as Dr. Williams has also noted, with some of what goes on or went on in the Black experience, Black church experience that he encountered in the South. He recognized his centrality. He recognized and appreciated the centrality of the Black preacher, the most peculiar human in America. He recognized that. And in recognizing that, he recognized that they were tapping into something that was not negotiable. They were tapping into something that was essential to understanding the world as the first point, affirming their humanity. To affirm their humanity is to affirm also the fact that they tapped into a way of engaging the world spiritually, engaging the world theologically, and engaging the world ethically, engaging the world in every other way that is shaped by religion. And in that sense, for me, he opens the door for discussions about the significance of religious thought, the significance of the spirit in our time, the significance of the spirit in terms of how we understand power, how we understand and appreciate and deal with both political power, social power, how we understand and deal with power in terms of good, evil, the demonic, the spirit, life, death. I mean, just the concept of saying that this is a non-negotiable a part of who we are as African people. I think that's something I'd like to maybe see us have a little bit more conversation about. I think he opens a door there. He opens a door for us and how to talk about the scriptures in our context, as well as open the door in terms of just this whole discussion as it relates to contemporary life. The next and last thing that I will emphasize, and maybe we'll come back and discuss even a bit more, is that in lifting up the gift of the Spirit, Dubois also opens a door for us to talk about some things that are peculiar to what's going on in American life now in general, and American life in general, as well as in the African American community. There's a book called The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, who is a NYU professor and a colleague, and another work, The Coddling of the American Mind. And though he himself is an atheist, I think that is one of the things he talks about in the book. But in the book, where he is talking about the impact of social media, the impact of cell phones, and all the things related upon children born since 2000. And he bemoans the fact that it robs them of so much one of the things that he talks about is the impact of the number of persons who are diagnosed with depression and other kinds of mental illnesses among kids who were born after 2000. He points to the absence of religion, or what happens in religious space, and what religious space and connection, what those things do to help in the growth and the development of humans and young people particularly. I would like to look at what Du Bois talks about in terms of the significance of the spirit in this context as a way of talking about maybe one of the things that is so absent in our times, and how we might be looking at human beings in the future moving forward. So I want to lift up those three things and then come back and maybe lift them up in discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. That was rich. Those 3 points. I want to introduce our fourth and final panelist, and then we're going to go ahead and to counter questions. Also want to continue to remind those that are joining and watching to go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A chat there, the Q&A bar. But our fourth panelist is Dr. Jonathan Tran. Dr. Tran is the Associate Dean for Faculty in the Honors College and Associate Professor of Theology and Great Text at Baylor University. His recent book is titled Asian Americans and the Spirit of Racial Capitalism, which was published by Oxford University Press. Dr. Tran is an academician, an intellect, and a man of faith who is also a fellow native Californian like myself. We're so glad that he is part of this panel, and we turn it over to him for his 10 minutes. Good to see you, Brother Jonathan.
It's good to see you, Professor. Thank you all for inviting me onto this really great occasion and this series over the course of the course of the year as a celebration of Du Bois. Du Bois is a huge influence in my life and has been for a long time. In these brief comments, I really want to do one thing, which is rehearse 4 quotes. One is going to be a critique of Du Bois offered by Cornel West, and it sounds like some of this critique has already been articulated today. So I'm also interested in seeing the conversation that follows. Secondly, I'm going to go to a quote in the reading on the spirit, where Du Bois seems to fall victim to what Professor West worries about. And then I'm going to return to Cornel West's comments where he talks about something called Black striving as a kind of radical democratic spirit, and suggests that's really where Du Bois ends up in his masterpiece, Black Reconstruction in America. So I don't think there needs to be much introduction to Cornel West, one of the greatest person of letters in the 20th and 21st century, Harvard, Princeton, Union Theological Seminary professor, extraordinary thinker, philosopher of American pragmatism, but also candidate for president and Counselor West on the Matrix movies. So, and a man who dons the same suit everywhere, though I hear he has 3 versions of it. So Cornel West is a hero to many, many of us. This is what Cornel West writes about the great Du Bois in West's own amazing essay, Black Strivings in a Twilight Civilization. And it's a remarkable set of comments. So let me read it. For those of us obsessed with alleviating Black social misery, the political texts of Du Bois are insightful and inspiring. In this sense, Du Bois is the brook of fire through which we all must pass in order to gain access to the intellectual and political weaponry needed to sustain the radical democratic tradition of our time. By the way, that claim about the need for democracy seems no more alive than it does right now. And in the midst of that, right, West says Du Bois is the brook of fire through which we must all pass. And it's hard to imagine that that's not the case right now. West continues, yet even this great titan of Black emancipation falls short of the mark. This is not to deny the remarkable subtlety of his mind or the undeniable sincerity of his heart. The grand example of Du Bois remains problematic principally owing to his inadequate interpretation of the human condition and his inability to immerse himself fully in the rich cultural currents of Black everyday life. Du Bois was first and foremost a Black New England Victorian seduced by the Enlightenment ethos and enchanted with the American dream. Again, this is just continuing West. His interpretation of the human condition, that is in part his idea of who he was and could be, was based on his experiences and most importantly on his understanding of those experiences through the medium of an Enlightenment zoo worldview that promoted Victorian strategies in order to realize an American optimism. So that's the critique that Professor West has of Professor Du Bois. West calls Du Bois a titan, and West himself is a titan. So that's what one titan views about the other titan. His comments there were directed specifically to Du Bois's early masterpiece, 1903, The Soul of Black Folks. Of course, the reading from today is The Gift of Black Folk, and clearly it's meant to mirror that earlier thing. The Gift of Black Folk comes some 20 years after The Souls of Black Folk. So there, as we've talked about, what Du Bois is trying to do is celebrate the contributions of Black life and American life. Now, let me read from that text where Du Bois talks about the contributions of Black religion. And here I would say, along with all of our august panelists, I also would recommend the work of Terrence Johnson on Black religion. Terrence teaches at Harvard, and the work of Vincent Lloyd at Villanova in his most recent book, Black Dignity. So read those along with this. But this is what Du Bois says about Black religion or Black Christianity. And notice hints of the things that West worries about. This is what he says. And I think we've talked about this already today. Du Bois writes, there's no doubt that influences of a primitive sort and customs that belong to the unlettered childhood of the race rather than to the thinking adult life of civilization crept in with the religious influence of the slave. Much of superstition even going so far as witchcraft, conjuring, and blood sacrifice for a long time marked Negro religion here and there in the swamps and islands. But on the other hand, it is just as true that the cold formalism of the upper class England and New England needed the wilder spiritual emotionalism of the Black man to weld out both a rational human religion based in kindliness and social uplift. And whether the influence of Negro religion was on the whole good or bad, the fact remains that it was potent in the white South and still is beyond the half-childish theology of formal religion. There has run in the heart of Black folk the greatest human achievements, love and sympathy, even for their enemies, for those who despised them and hurt them and did them nameless ill. They have nursed the sick and closed the staring eyes of the dead. They have given friendship to the friendless. They have shared the pittance of their poverty and the outcast and the nameless. They have been good and true and pitiful to the bad and false and pitiless. And in this lies the real grandeur of their simple religion, the mightiest gift of Black to white America. So I want to point out two things about this quote from Du Bois that reflects what West worries about. On the one hand, clearly Du Bois has grown from the Du Bois that West critiqued in The Souls of Black Folk, where he simply presented Black folks as a kind of primitive, the kind of existence of the human before Enlightenment reason came along, which Enlightenment reason is the thing, according to West, that Du Bois prized so much and prized so much about America. So at least in 1903, in The Souls of Black Folk, it's only the primitive. I think there's a bit more, but let's just go with what West says. By the time he writes this in 1924, it's evolved. It's still the primitive, right? The primitivity of, say, religion as witchcraft, but it also yields a certain kind of moral good that serves as a counterweight to, on the one hand, the cold reasoning of Enlightenment thinking, and on the other hand, the immorality of white Enlightenment thinking. So the kind of primitivity of a kind of tribal religion yields a moral good as a counterweight. So he still holds on to a kind of a lack of respect, say, for what West calls the average Black person. But he still tries to derive some good contributions out of it. You can imagine West, his critique of the earlier text would probably apply here. So to get a sense of what West is after instead, and then to get a sense of why Black Reconstruction in America should probably be understood as the kind of mature Du Bois, Du Bois at his greatest powers, we'll need to read this. So this is what West says later on in Black Strivings. And remember, he's saying this against what Du Bois is portraying about Black life in those two earlier pieces. West says, Black strivings are the creative and complex products of the terrifying African encounter with the absurd in America and the absurd as America. Like any group of human beings, Black people forge ways of life and ways of struggle under circumstances not of their own choosing. They constructed structures of meaning and structures of feeling in the face of fundamental facts of human existence: death, dread, despair, disease, and disappointment. Yet the specificity of Black culture, namely those features that distinguish Black culture from other cultures, lies in both the African and American character of Black people's attempts to sustain their mental sanity and spiritual health. Social life and political struggle in the midst of a slave-holding white supremacist civilization that viewed itself as the most enlightened, free, tolerant, and democratic experiment in human history. So West isn't for what he sees Du Bois after in those earlier texts. But notice finally that what he describes here as this Black striving, which is the spirit for West at this moment, less of the religion and more of the democratic spirit, is remarkably where Du Bois lands at the tail end of his career when he writes his masterpiece, Black Reconstruction in America. And here I'm just going to read two sentences from the end of Black Reconstruction, which is again 1935. Du Bois writes, and notice how similarly, so how far this is from the kind of primitivism of which he understood ordinary Black life, and how close then he comes to the kind of radical democratic spirit of what West is after in Black Strivings. He says, Du Bois, the most magnificent drama in the last 1,000 years of human history is the transportation of 10 million human beings out of the dark beauty of their mother continent into the newfound El Dorado of the West. They descended into hell, and in the third century rose from the dead in the finest effort to achieve democracy for the working millions which the world has ever seen. Notice the very clear, powerful theological reference to Christ's crucifixion and resurrection, that Black life embodied and participated in that crucifixion and resurrection and arising, and in that arising becomes the first true moment of democracy in America. Recall that for Du Bois, democracy in America does not begin with emancipation. It doesn't end with democracy doesn't end when enslavement ends. I mean, democracy doesn't begin when emancipation begins. It doesn't begin with the Civil War. It doesn't begin with Reconstruction. Democracy for Du Bois, the mature Du Bois, begins the moment Black people end up on the shores of America and put the question to America about its claims and aspirations for enlightenment. Call time on that for the evil that it is. And the very people who are enslaved, who suffer these brutalities, are the very ones who carry on the back the first real opportunity for democratic life in America. That's what West calls Black striving, and that's what Du Bois ends with at the tail end of his career in Black Reconstruction in America. It is the story of the Black Reconstruction of America. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tran. That was rich. And I want to invite all of the panelists to go ahead and turn on your camera screens. This has been rich. I want to go in a different direction. I want to make a comment, and hopefully there's a question. There's multiple questions that generate a conversation that cuts across the field. Now I realize I'm the only Bible scholar here on a panel with 4 theologians. So that's going to be so I have much much reflection here. Um, so thank you all for each of your comments. They really I think they really set the tone for the way that we think about Du Bois. Du Bois's contribution to where we are today, 21st century globally, not just here in America, but also in the UK context, but globally. Um, Professor Tran, I think of those quotes, particularly Cornel West's quote, and it reminds me of well, it reminds me of a conversation between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. In 1913, Du Bois published his kind of expose when he visited Pasadena, California, my hometown. He talked about his visiting the Black community, particularly in Pasadena and Los Angeles, and some of the what he described as a kind of a utopian Black life. Particularly, this is before. Well, this is actually some 40 years after, or maybe 60 years after California was annexed into the United States in 1850, and he talked about how Blacks and mulattoes particularly owned land, and he kind of saw this as a kind of a utopian, particularly to how Black life was in the South. This is 1913. But later on, because Du Bois comes to California in 1913, but Booker T. Washington comes to California, Pasadena in 1907, but also 1914 or something like that. But he critiques Du Bois, and it's kind of the same critique that Du Bois spends time mostly with the Black business owners, the Black landowners, but he doesn't go into the heart of the community where the domestics were those who are actually living a kind of life where it's not a utopian. So it's kind of it's a very similar critique that Cornel West offers. And I'm curious what that says, particularly of maybe a blind spot there with Du Bois. And I don't know if there's a question in there, a comment in there, but I think about also when I spent time in the UK, in Manchester. I used to walk past a building on my way to the University of Manchester, and it was actually one of the Manchester Metropolitan University buildings. And I noticed an orange sign on there, and one day I approached that sign, and it was a plaque that said, "Here was where the 1946 Pan-African, Fourth Pan-African Congress was held." I used to walk past this building every day on my way to class at the University of Manchester, and so I'm thinking, and this kind of goes to Dr. Stone's comments and Dr. Johnson. I'm wondering to what extent, in 1946, thinking about this critique from Du Bois, from Booker T. Washington, and how Du Bois has this kind of elitism, or maybe a kind of a talented tenth notion of his mind. But now in Manchester, now in the UK, now in a kind of a Pan-African kind of quest, but also noting the centrality of the Black preacher, the centrality of the spirit, the centrality of Black life, and taking all of this embodiment with him. To Dr. Johnson's point, um, how do you think the Black community, or the people in the UK, or people in that particular time, view Du Bois? Do they have, or do they level this critique? Booker T. Washington levels, maybe some of the early, I guess this would be pre-Windrush. Um, um, but I'm wondering how Du Bois is viewed kind of across all of these contexts, him understanding the centrality of Black life, Black spirit, Black preacher, but also having this kind of fire as well, this Pan-African kind of quest. Um, it's kind of a comment. I throw it out there. I wanted to kind of cut across the grain. Maybe there's something that each of you can kind of pick up on. There probably wasn't a question in any of that, but your thoughts on just looking at Du Bois, and a lot of what you said was very relevant. Lots of meat there. Anybody?
Yeah, I could start. I mean, I think that we do. I mean, I read Wes's critique of Du Bois, and I think there's a lot there. I mean, Wes is, again, a huge influence on in the entirety of American letters as he should be. I will also say this. My guess is that we are the domesticators of Du Bois, just like we're the domesticators of King. So we want to read King in terms of the I have a dream speech. We don't want to, as my pastor, Malcolm Foley, constantly reminds us, we don't tend to want to read King as the anti-imperialist, the anti-capitalist, the pro-labor, the pro-anti-poverty agitator. It's the same thing. My guess is that it says more about us that we remember certain points about Du Bois than the kind of broad evolution of his thought, especially as it kind of evolved about his thinking about, say, that, as you mentioned, the talented 10th, but also as a kind of a more radical democratic politics towards the tail end of his career, as people like Marable Manable have talked about. So I just want to say that all sounds right. I think you're exactly right to turn to the Du Bois, Booker T. Washington. I think there's a lot more richness that we can get from that. I think the way we read that debate also is a litmus test for what we wanted to get out of the debate. I tend to want to read the later Du Bois as really an amalgamation of the earlier parts of those things that he seemed to be pitted against in terms of Booker T. That is, Booker T was after a political economic revolution. And I think so at the end was Du Bois.
Anybody else want to jump in? I particularly I like this fire you talk about, Dr. Stone, but also kind of in this conversation where Du Bois sees the centrality of Black spirit, Black life, kind of the dignity of humanity, the dignity of Black life, which potentially does that drive the quest for his Pan-Africanism in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, I really find the comments you've made, Professor Tran, really helpful. I'm not a Du Bois scholar at all, but he's not really the center of my thought or at the center. But when I was reflecting on the gifting language as problematic, partly because I'm thinking about, so in our UK context, the Windrush generation transition begins in kind of 1948. And there's a kind of gifting language used of that. These African Caribbeans are coming to the UK to help rebuild post-war Britain, and it's a very insidious kind of gifting that's been understood in that it's not really an inherent value of Black life. It's a value of Black labour, a particular kind of labour that's low paid, insecure, marked by racial hostilities and violence. It's that kind of labour, and it's a labour that's valued but not dignified or given the dignity that it deserves. And so that's what makes me uncomfortable about the language. Is it a kind of gifting that's used to build up a kind of, in the UK context, a British imperialistic dreams? In order for African Caribbeans to be gifts to the UK, that means that they're not in the Caribbean, rebuilding those economies that have been decimated by colonialism. So there's all that's going on, I think, in the gifting, in the language of gifting, which I think is what makes me a little bit uncomfortable about it. But I found those comments really helpful, Professor Tran, because I think that idea of the kind of evolution of his thought, I think, helps me to engage a bit more with the later Du Bois, maybe.
Yeah, and I did when you made the comment about where he's talking about the characteristics of the Black spirit and the kind of pastoral, embracing, forgiving, and all of that. I was thinking about that yesterday and just kind of getting ready for today. There was another side to it too, that he talks about, that the experience, the two-ness, the two souls, if you will, of Black folk. That on the one side there is that Black, being African, etc., and then the American side. And he says that creates both two kinds of spirituality. One that could lead to the Nat Turners of the world, and another that leads down another track to another more kind of accommodating, embracing way of looking at the world, which you could also put that in the context of the Du Bois Washington debates. I think he had both. There was both sides to it, and he recognizes both sides as being product of this spirituality. That's my reading of it. And the gifting kind of gives you both and, not either or, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I'm wondering to borrow and to use this language, Dr. Williams, you talked about that's in what Du Bois talks about Black life, Black spirituality injecting into society.
Hmm.
But what is Du Bois injected into kind of a global um, Black spirituality, if you will? Kind of going back and looking at this development of Du Bois from the turn of the century, understanding the centrality of Black life, to Pan-Africanism, meeting with these global leaders for the liberation of the African continent. What's injected? And also, what's injected today? What can Du Bois, if Du Bois was to give advice today, we know what he says and how we're applying and making it applicable. But what's the advice that's being said today? Or what advice would he say, particularly in our global kind of hyper politicized context today? What would be injected that maybe he might reiterate, or would he change? Because we also see Du Bois' his development. He leaves America in 1961, goes to Ghana, kind of almost renouncing potentially this talented 10th idea, this maybe this integrationist idea, and he goes to
Hmm.
Ghana. But still, Ghana, the centrality of Black life, what does he see there? What's still injected? What advice would he have for us today? I just kind of throw that out, lob that out.
I'll start again just to get us going. I apologize. I came in late. I was so excited to be. I was so honored to be invited to this panel. I said yes before remembering I had class during this time, so that's why I've just come in now. So I only got Professor Johnson's comments at the end. But what I imagine he would say to us today would be an amalgamation of that picture of Black Reconstruction, the substance of which is the religion that Professor Johnson talked about, that the radical Democrat in him and the view of African Americans playing these kinds of roles in a sense, what I took to be Dr. Johnson's notion of the two sides of the gift. That's what I imagine he would be after with us today. So
And as you're collating your thoughts, I'm seeing these questions here, and so trying to ask them in kind of the broadest way. I know this question kind of comes from Dr. Stone's comments. This notion of can the language of gift be um, I don't know, say revitalize or repackage, or how can we think of this maybe in a positive way, or is there some redemption value, or should we know this idea of fire as gift, burn it all down, which is interesting because Du Bois leaves for Ghana and dies on the eve of the March on Washington. What symbolically is that suggesting or saying?
It's a really good question. I think we probably got to it by hearing about this two sides of the gift. Um, that does have everything all covered. And I think fire also can cook food. It doesn't just burn things down. It can also be quite constructive in some really good ways. So I think we've kind of got that really in the sense of having the two sides of the gift. I think that's helped me a lot to understand this as well.
Dr. Hopkins, I just looked up that quote, the Du Bois that you alluded to earlier, from September 13th, 1961. Du Bois says, this is in a letter that he writes to Grace Goins. He says, I just can't take any more of this country's treatment. We leave for Ghana October 5th, and I set no date for return. Chin up and fight on, but realize that American Negroes can't win.
That's chilling. And that clearly is advice.
Yes.
That's advice. So, what's being injected? What has Du Bois left? I mean, see his blind spots. We talk about this development. Um, what is still yet being injected? What is the gift? Yeah, what's being injected today?
You know, I like to continue to think that, again, that he didn't fully get his mind around the depth of Black religion, but he understood how important it was, that it was fundamental and foundational. And so, you know, I think when he talks about how the community has survived, he looks at the centrality of this institution in that. And I think with all of its foibles, where he becomes relevant is that it's in the well springs of spirituality, that everything else flows from there. And going forward, I think that's something that we have to continue to pay attention to, that everything flows from there. That's the wellspring, that's the ocean. And you go back and make all these other connections and push forward politically and economically and culturally and all of that. But the ocean is the birthplace.
Yeah,
For me, that is.
definitely. So just a few questions here from the audience here. So Dr. Johnson, how can we shift movements or improve them to ensure the message of affirming is being emphasized rather than apologizing? This comes from one of our audience.
Affirming rather than apologizing. If you're putting it in his context in terms of his how he understands Black life in America,
Yeah,
are we
there's
talking in that context?
yeah, and it looks like there's a follow-up. This is more in reference to the gift of the gift, in particular, the language of gift. You mentioned that there's a risk of the weaponization historically.
That was
Uh,
clarifying my question.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
okay.
That was Dr. Stone's question, point, right?
Oh, okay, I
Yeah,
think
that
so.
was her point.
Let's see. There's another one. I don't know if I asked this one for Dr. Stone. This is Dr. Stone, great to see you and hear you, and perhaps this is not the best context to trace out a deeper conversation about how gift in this plane of Dubois, but are you now speaking about this? Yeah, so I don't know. There seems like there's some gaps there here. Um, just kind of going through these questions. Here's one. How does Black classism within the church, particularly the Black church, enter the conversation, if it does? The spirituality of gifting is defined, expressed, and accepted in a hierarchy from my perspective as a Pentecostal formation that has expanded to non-denominational. Does that grab anyone?
Can you read the question part of it again?
So how does classism within the church, particularly the Black church, enter the conversation? This idea of spirituality is defined. So, yeah, is there, yeah, how does one read the Black church? I mean, this kind of, I think, maybe spawns the notion of, you talk about the decline of the Black church in America, the decline of the Black church in the UK. When I was in Manchester, and this was in 2004, there were churches that were becoming climbing facilities. There were churches, big grand structures, grand cathedrals becoming flats. And so the decline of the church, the decline of the Black church, um, what is that suggesting for Black life and maybe for the gift? Particularly, we talk about the gift of the Spirit. Is the gift of the Spirit in decline? If we maybe were to ask that in that way.
I wonder if the person's question they were referring to, what came to my mind when I heard the question the second time was around worship kind of practices. Because as we know, Du Bois in his work talks about what the frenzy of shouting. But then there are these other more highbrow kinds of traditions that he also attends to in his work. In fact, I was reading one of his quotes last night where he talked about when he had himself had gone to the worship to see these the folk who were worshiping in Tennessee when he was in the country.
Right.
And he even talked about how frightened he was, that he himself was afraid to see the these what he might have called kind of how did he say in Souls of Black Folks, when the Spirit of the Lord passed by, seizing the devotees, making them mad with supernatural joy, seeing these people mad with supernatural joy. And I think that is in terms of Black church life today, the question of worship styles, worship music, those are real kind of real time questions and tensions within congregations around how people express and practice their kinds of liturgical devotions. So that was what I wondered if that question was speaking to that.
I've thought a lot about Du Bois in recent months because of what's happening politically here. The way he ends Black Reconstruction is largely where it begins. Democracy is never really quite realized in America, even though its possibility arrives with Black life in America as the only place really where democracy matters. It also ends with a classist backlash by white elites marshaling race against poor people, workers. You know, he begins the book with the Black worker, the white worker, and it's the marshaling of race and a pitting against one another that breaks the back of democracy. And it's hard not to imagine that downstream it names quite powerfully where we are. You know, early Du Bois was a Hegelian. Gift was the moment of negation that brought progress. Clearly, he doesn't believe that. For many of us in Waco, part of that, what proliferates this, I imagine, is, you know, what he came to call the Waco horror, the lynching of Jesse Washington. And as Black churches in my city in Waco sometimes interpret the Waco tornado some years later as God's vengeance for that God had, in a sense, given up on the democratic experiment because of its ruination on, say, people of color, immigrants, what have you. So it's hard not to read his, the real gift of his judgment as a continual assessment of American life.
Well, anything else? Because I wanted us to kind of get to concluding remarks, but I want to preface that with how Du Bois, or the context that forms Du Bois's development in the gift of the Spirit, and in a number of his works, because he dies in 1960s. And I was just looking at some numbers, pretty much where the Black church is today globally. And so the Council of National Black Churches touts about 80% of African American Christians makes up its membership, with over 30,000 Black congregations, which represents about 20 million people. Lincoln and Mamiya, in their classic work, The Black Church and the African American Experience, talk about the 7 historic Black churches, of which the Church of God in Christ, and in a number of websites, a few websites, they tout numbers as being upwards to about 5.5 million members across 60 countries. And this is noted or dated between 2006 and 2016. There's another site related to Church of God in Christ, which estimates at 2017 about 6.6 million members and about 12,000 congregations. Congregations about 112 countries around the world. The African Methodist Episcopal Church, they note about 3.5 million members globally. The National Baptist Church USA, on a website suggests about 7 million globally. And the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, about 1.2 million members globally. Du Bois writes in 1924, The Gift of the Black Folks. And we talked a little bit about maybe what he may have missed, what some blind spots are, but with the kind of growth, there's a decline of churches globally, but there seems to be growth globally with Black church, Black spirituality. With that in mind, um, when you think about the gift of the Spirit, context of Du Bois, and pretty much where we're going, if you just had some concluding remarks, where do we go from here? How can a continued engagement with Du Bois be beneficial? How should we approach that? But just maybe some parting thoughts as we conclude. And we could start maybe, well, whoever wants to jump in. Dr. Johnson, maybe?
Oh, okay. I guess I go back to my previous point, and I was, as you were framing the question, just kind of pondering. And Du Bois ended up a cynic as it relates to America, right? Pretty much. That's what we concluded. That's why he left, right? We're there. Then we've also concluded and looking at his evolution that it was organized religion, organized Christianity was not a part of his public posture. It was not a part of, he is a scientist, a social scientist, never purporting to be a practitioner. That said, I think what he points to for me and opening the door and talking about the gifts of the Black, of the gift of the Spirit, and putting it, and spirit broadly understood, religion and the importance of religion in the shaping of this history. I don't think we get to outgrow, that we analyze. So I think it's still in that space. It's in just pondering what's in that space, what comes out of that space, what frightened him, as Eric noted earlier, when he went to that revival down in Tennessee. What frightened him, frightened the life out of him. Well, maybe in these contexts, we need spaces that do that to us, that challenge whatever those sides of ourselves existentially and culturally, that make us think we got it all locked down. No, it's not all locked down. And there are dimensions to the complexities of life that we don't get. And we can't just chronicle them in a book and lock them away. I think there's something about, continuing to revisit the space. And it's not going to be left up to us as to what we find when we get there, as to where it leads us, as to what it does. We don't escape that as scholars. But he opens the door that I think, again, this connection, and maybe it's something I'll get clear later, but how you make this connection to what Haidt points out in this book, dealing with, this generation of young Americans and the absence of real engagement around sacred space, whatever form of, whatever your denominations are. I think how we engage that's another point. He opens a door. Maybe we find ways to integrate more this issue of spirituality, broadly speaking.
Yeah. Yeah. Dr. Tran, concluding thoughts?
I'm one of the people who thinks that America has come to an end. But I think for those of us Christians, I think this means this is the time of the church. And what I mean by church is what I understand Dr. Johnson is saying. Again, let me read just a snippet from the Du Bois quote that I earlier problematized through West, but now I want to read in terms of the later Du Bois. The heart of Black folk as the greatest of human achievement, love and sympathy, even for their enemies, so on and so forth. Borrowing from someone closer to Professor Stone's side of the pond, Paul Gilroy talks about the new humanity. What I hope is that the emergence of the church from the ashes of America will be a new humanity in the way that Du Bois talks about here.
Thank you. Dr. Stone, concluding thoughts?
It's interesting being here as somebody who's in the British context, and I always feel a kind of it's lost for us in our space where we don't have these towering figures who have done this incredible scholarly work. And so we're often reflecting through African American texts and about how this relates. And I think it's again reminding me, now that I need reminding, of how important it is that we in our own space do the work of really cultivating scholars who are really doing that important work of centering Black communities, communities that just don't get centered in the kind of sociological and religious work and theological work that is done in our contexts, because that is where so much of this important work happens. It's where reimagining can take place from the position of places that we don't often focus on in our academic work, as in the kind of mainstream theological work that happens here. So I'm grateful for the conversation and inspired. Thank you very much.
No, we're grateful for you. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Dr. Williams, final thoughts there.
Yes, so one of the things that this has done for me, especially questions around, the question of ambivalence around religion, is as a student of religion and one who teaches religion, to be more attentive to the transformation of religion and to track religion where it is, not where, how did Heschel said that how did he say it? To know what one sees and not to see what one knows. And so that this is, but I want my concluding comments to be a prayer from Du Bois, if that's okay. Okay, let me read this prayer. Give us grace, O God, to dare to do the deed which we well know. Cries to be done. Let us not hesitate because of ease or the words of men's or women's mouths or our own lives. This is the part that I really like. Mighty causes are calling us. The freeing of women, the training of children, the putting down of hate and murder and poverty, all of these and more. But they call with voices that mean work and sacrifices and death. Mercifully grant us, O God, the spirit of Esther, that we say, I will go unto the king, and if I perish, I perish. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you all for this rich conversation, this rich discussion. I want to encourage those who are watching, whether or not you're watching now, you're watching later, please follow these brilliant minds. Dr. Williams at Duke University Divinity School, Dr. Selina Stone, University of Edinburgh and the United Kingdom, Dr. Alonzo Johnson and South Carolina at Allen University's Dickerson-Green Theological Seminary, and Dr. Jonathan Tran. I could probably only say for maybe a few more weeks here at Baylor University, but he's going to be
blame Dr. Williams for this, by the way.
He'll be over there at Duke. So, but please, I encourage you to follow these brilliant intellectual minds and the work, the groundbreaking work, the important work that they're doing, because they have lots to offer and lots to speak into, particularly the world that we live in today. So thank you all so much for being part of this conversation and for this this final installment of the W.E.B. Du Bois webinars celebrating the 100th anniversary of the gift of Black folks. And I have a few parting words on behalf of the committee that brought together this series. As we draw this series to a close, our team would like to invite each of you to keep this conversation alive and to help us in building a bridge between Du Bois's groundbreaking insight and the work that lies ahead. There's lots of work that lies ahead. Please watch for an email in your inbox. It will include a link to all 7 presentations together with our resource guide. More importantly, it will invite you to write a short letter or reflection to Du Bois, thanking him, questioning him, or extending his vision into your own context. These letters to Du Bois will become part of a living archive, a testimony of sorts to how his words, his thoughts continue to spark inquiry, critique, and inspiration. By lending your voice, you join a community who will carry this dialogue far beyond today and closing. And of course, stay tuned for the conversations that we've begun here and how they will blossom into new projects, new collaborations, and add avenues of research in the months to come. And I want to even just have us consider, imagine our work, our scholarship, being spoken about 100 years from today. Imagine that. Imagine that. That's the work that is at stake. And so I leave you with Du Bois's own words from The Gift of the Black Folks. And it is, we who know may not forget, but must forever spread the splendid, sordid truth that out of the most lowly and persecuted of men, man or humanity made in America, man made America. And that what man has here begun with all its wants and imperfections, with all its magnificent promise and grotesque failures, will someday blossom into the souls of the lowly. W.E.B. Du Bois, The Gift of Black Folks. Thank you all for your deep engagement in this conversation this year and the string of W.E.B. Du Bois webinars. We look forward to reading your letters, carrying forth the questions, and witnessing together how and we will continue to make and remake America. Thank you all. Blessings to you.